So I've been in the field since 1994, which is a little more than a decade. And I know, I look so young. I know. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about building a world worth living in. We're going to talk about some stats, going to talk about some ideas. Let's see. Show of hands, who here is a mental health professional, kind of direct practice? Okay. Educator? Okay. Medical professional? Okay. All right. Policy, administrative? Okay. All right. So we have a nice map. There are a bunch of people, I have no idea who you are, because I could go on for like an hour just naming professions. But let's look at the slides. So when we talk about suicide, we oftentimes think about the one-on-one interactions. We often think about talking with a person who is sharing their sort of innermost, possibly most shameful, embarrassing fears about life. We're focused on their body movements, the tone of their voice. We then we talk to somebody else. There's a lot of one-on-one interactions. But we have to remember that suicide is social, that it is societal, and that it is structural. And so I always like to start my presentations with a reminder that if we want a world where people feel like their lives are worth living, we can't have a society that says that some lives are worth more than others. And so in my work with kids in schools, out in the community, those one-on-one interactions are that much harder when you have legislation, when you have policy, when you have community groups that are saying, this group of people, you don't belong. You are not as important as this other group of people. And so, if you want to have your one-on-one interactions go better, you have to be involved in advocacy, in legislation, in policy efforts to make sure that we do have a society where kids can show up, where adults can walk into work, where people can be on the streets, and they can say, you know what, this is a place where they value me. That's foundational. Some of the terms that we talk about in suicide prevention that are preferred or problematic. This is a short list, but they're key. So back in the 90s when I was trained in suicide prevention, we would talk all the time about so-and-so has 3 failed suicide attempts, or their sibling successfully killed themselves. These days, we like to, we acknowledge that framing a failed suicide attempt as a failure, right? So living as a failure and dying as a success is problematic. And so we just remove those words, right? So it's a suicide attempt or it's a death. It's not a failed suicide attempt. It's not a failed suicide. It's not a successful suicide attempt. Another term is non-serious versus serious suicide attempt. Every suicide attempt is serious. Sometimes it can be helpful to say lethal, because there are methods that are more or less lethal. So for example, firearms. 9 out of every 10 suicide attempts with a firearm ends in death. It's the most lethal means. 6% of suicide attempts are with firearms. 55% of suicide deaths are due to firearms. 2/3 of all firearm deaths are suicides. Firearms are incredibly lethal. If we could get rid of all the firearms in the United States, which is not going to happen, we would cut the suicide rate in more than in half overnight. We'd go from 50,000 to about 22,000, right? So you can talk about a more or less lethal method. Acetaminophen, Tylenol, incredibly lethal, very lethal. That's why there are all these accidental overdoses that happen, right? You get folks that take Theraflu, it's got acetaminophen, they still feel crappy, they pop a couple Tylenol, boom, they've exceeded the therapeutic dosage, their internal organs start shutting down, 5 days later they're dead. So you can talk about low lethality versus high lethality, there's some value to that, but serious versus non-serious diminishes the experience of the person who's attempted. And the last one is the phrase committed suicide. And what we know from suicide attempt survivors, suicide loss survivors, is that the word committed has this association, has a negative association with things like committed rape, committed murder, or even being committed to a psychiatric institution. And so instead of saying committed suicide, again, we simplify and we just say died by suicide or killed themselves. So I want to go over some stats, and these are going to focus mostly on youth suicide. Now, what we know is that starting in 2000, we saw the rates of suicide go up, go down, and then in 2007, there's a pretty steady increase all the way until you got to about 2017. It plateaued for a few years, then it went back up again. A lot of hypotheses as to why, right? A lot of speculation. Folks were like, oh, well, 2007, that's when the iPhone came out. That's when Facebook went public. This must be social media and smartphones. And I think there is a contribution of social media and smartphones to the increase in emotional unwellness of our youth. But also, 2007 to 2009, we had the Great Recession, right? So second biggest economic disaster in our nation's history. It was a long time. It also, because of the way that subprime mortgages targeted black and brown communities, disproportionately affected black and brown folks. And so we have competing hypotheses. I will say that one of the challenges with the social media smartphone hypothesis is that when you look at data from 2022 and then 2023, we see a continued decrease in youth suicide rates, and it doesn't correlate or correspond with a decreased use of social media or smartphones for that age group. So there are other ways to think about data. You can look at it by age group. So oftentimes you'll hear in the news about suicide rates for kids 10 to 24, 15 to 24. I wanted to just clarify that when you look at it 10 to 14, the suicide rate, if you look at 2001 to 2018, the suicide rate more than doubled for kids 10 to 14. And when you look at the next age group, 15 to 19, you can see that far more kids 15 to 19 die by suicide. And that actually the group in that 10 to 24 with the highest suicide rate, representing the vast majority of suicide deaths, are 20 to 24. There are a couple of things that I think are important about this. One is that the work that we do in primary and secondary education around identification, providing supports, addressing suicide risk, there's actually a lifespan effect, right? So if we want to reduce suicide rates overall, addressing what's happening in the younger years is going to pay dividends as kids get older. Now, we know there's different contexts. Kids leave home. They may or may not be going to college. They're getting jobs. Their insurance, they lose their insurance. They don't have access to medication, mental health services, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of things can be going on. But it is important to think about this age group not just as a monolith, right? But as the different risk associated with each strata for suicide risk. Now, another way to think about the data is by looking at calendar year. So I pulled together data from 20 years, so 1999 to 2019, by month. And these are for kids 10 to 19. So again, I was talking 10 to 24, now I'm talking 10 to 19. And I did this so that it was solidly within the K through 12, right? So you've got primarily middle and high school kids here. And the way to read this is that in January, the number 3942, that's the raw number. So that means that over 20 years, in the month of January, 3,942 kids between the ages of 10 and 19 died by suicide. Based on the previous slide, we can assume that the majority of those were in the 15 to 19 category. Well, there's a pattern here, right? So it starts high in January, goes down in February, goes back up again, right? It peaks, then it dips. Then it's low in June and July. It goes back up again. August, September, October, November, it starts to decrease, and it's low again in December. So you don't have to have a Ph.D. to read this slide, right? So the fewest number of suicide deaths happen when? Yeah, summer and December. So it's the vacation months, right? So when kids are not in school, fewer of them die by suicide. And the most number of suicide deaths happen in January, right after they come back from winter break. And we could roughly call it midterm, right? Different schools have different labels, but it's basically middle of the semester. I wrote a whole book called Suicide in Schools. I'm deeply dedicated to addressing suicide risk in schools, and I would be a bad researcher if I did not acknowledge that this suggests there is an effect of school on suicide deaths amongst youth. Now, I want you to look at the spring, so the dotted line, because this only goes to 2019. And something very interesting happened in 2020. You might not remember. Thank you for laughing. That was good. Bit of levity twixt all the sadness. So you have, what you can see in 2020 is the pattern starts the same. It's high in January, it decreases in February. But instead of going back up, it goes down. And it goes down again. And it goes down to the point where there are fewer suicide deaths in May than there are during the summer months. And then in summer months, you see the same plateau, and then it goes back up again in the same pattern. So what happened? Well, in schools, everybody went fully remote across the country for at least 2 weeks, right? Even in school districts that my friends live in Texas, that basically were like, yeah, we were out for 2 weeks and then we came back, right? No masks, we just came back. Everybody was out. So what happened during this time? Lots of things. I'm going to rapid fire this. Ready? High school students got on average 45 minutes more sleep per night in the beginning of the pandemic. There was much more opportunity for informal conversation with family members for high school students, right? They weren't going to their jobs. They weren't going to their after-school activities. They weren't going out with friends. There was no FOMO, no fear of missing out, right? Because I didn't have to worry what Topaz was doing on the weekend because she was stuck at home with her parents just like I was, right? Teachers, and this is no diss on teachers, teachers went pass-fail for everybody. Nobody failed. There was no pressure to be like, oh my God, what if I don't pass, right? What happens? Everybody was passed because nobody knew how to do this. My twin boys were in the 2nd grade. My daughter was in the 6th grade. We had a no-screen policy at home. On March 13th, my boys came home with iPads. I was like, what are we doing here? What's happening, right? So all this change, all these things shifted. There was also a sense that there was this invisible enemy Do you remember spraying down your groceries? We literally had no idea, like, what is this thing? So weird. Like 5 years later, people are like, yeah, I've got COVID. People are like, okay, do you have a mask? I think so. Hold on, right? We all learned how to wear masks. So those are some of the things that happened. The other things that happened, right? There was a rush on buying firearms. So more firearms were purchased in that period than at any other time. And research by Mike Anestis and colleagues that came out later suggested that first-time firearm owners, or people that bought firearms for the first time during the pandemic, were more likely to kill themselves than firearm owners that purchased second or third or additional firearms during that time. You also had kids that saw school as a safe place, right? Maybe where they could be out with their gender identity, their sexual orientation. Maybe they were trying on different identities, and they could do that at school, but they couldn't do that at home. They were stuck at home then, right, with people that were misgendering them. They were stuck with parents who were themselves struggling with substance use, their own psychiatric disorders, right? There was a lack of mental health services. Clinics were shutting down, going fully telehealth, and people were told, don't go to the hospitals, right? So there were a lot of bad things that happened. It feels weird to like have to say that, but there were bad things that happened during the pandemic. But one of the good things that happened was that there was a decrease in youth suicide rates. And then when everybody went back to school, either hybrid or online, hybrid, or in person, we see the suicide rates go up again, and they return to the old pattern. Now, if we look at the data since then, what we can see, and again, the orange line is 2020, and the green line is a 3-year spread, 21 through 23. We can see that the pattern remains. So it's high in January, it's low in February. And the green line here, you can see it goes back up, it goes back down in the summer months, then it goes back up again. The line's not as smooth because we don't have as many data points, but the trend is back. So I think that there's some really, I think it's the basic take home for this is that it's really important to acknowledge that there is an effect of school on suicide risk, and it would do well by our society to figure out what's going on and how we can think about schools as a place to really reduce suicide risk for youth. Now, there's some myths related to suicide that I think are helpful to unpack. One of them is that suicide is a white people problem. And this is a myth that's been perpetuated by suicide professionals, by the data, the research. Now, what's true is that numerically, the vast majority of suicide deaths are in white people, particularly white men. But when we look at percentages, or rather when we look at rates of suicide, we can see that depending on what demographic group we're looking at, suicide rates are not highest amongst white people. So if we're looking at youth 10 to 24, we can see that American Indian, Alaska Native have the highest suicide rates. And this would be true. This says 2021. This would be true if it said 2023, if it said 2018. Also, indigenous communities in all of the sort of former British colonies, so the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the indigenous communities have the highest suicide rates. So this is not unique to the United States. And again, it speaks to the issues of structure and society and culture that are embedded in the experience of suicide. Now, having said all this, I do want to acknowledge that even though the headlines speak a lot about youth suicide, that in fact, the highest suicide rates are amongst adults. So even the highest suicide rate for youth, the 10 to 24, is lower than almost any adult age bracket. Now, the other thing that's true is that most of us do not work with death. Even though suicide prevention might be our thing, we're working around preventing suicide. And so our focus is on youth who are having thoughts of suicide or are engaging in suicidal behaviors, right, suicide attempts. And so if we look at the stats on youth suicidal ideation and attempt, what we can see is that based on different demographics, folks are at different risk. So just the quick way to read this, and then I'm going to go through all these categories fairly quickly. So you can see female high school students, so 9th through 12th grade, 27% of them said that in the past year they had seriously considered killing themselves, right? And then for the male students, it was 14%. And so you can see by category that there are differences. Again, with race and ethnicity, we have the highest in the American Indian and Alaska Native youth. High school, we have highest in 9th grade and the lowest percentage in 12th grade. And then among sexual orientation, the highest amongst bisexual youth, right? Nearly almost 1 in 2 high school students who identify as bisexual said they had seriously considered killing themselves in the past year. Then when we look at suicide attempts, and the CDC differentiates between suicide attempts and suicide attempts with medical attention. This is the suicide attempts, not the suicide attempts with medical attention. But you can see that almost 10% of high school students in 2020 said that they had attempted suicide, so 1 in 10. And it mostly follows a similar trend with ideation in terms of percentage, right? There are a couple of differences. One, Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander, significantly more, sort of the ratio, percentage-wise, reported a suicide attempt relative to the numbers that reported ideation. And historically, there's been a similar trend for Black or African American youth. It's unclear why that is. Could be that folks aren't comfortable reporting ideation, but they're comfortable reporting attempt. Or it could be that folks are attempting without what we think of as ideation. So those are some things we're still trying to figure out. And then we can see similar trends here. And so these numbers are important, and the way to think about these data are important for folks who are doing programming in schools. Now this isn't intersectional, right? So nowhere on here can I explain what it might be like for a bisexual Hispanic 9th grader, right? I don't have those data, but you could if that was something that you were interested in your high school and doing some programming about, figuring out what are the highest and lowest suicide rates relative to these different categories. So another myth is that people who are suicidal are weak. And what's true is that people can be suicidal despite enormous strength and courage. And I found this image online that I thought did a really nice job of illustrating it. It says, "Do not confuse my bad days as a sign of weakness. Those are actually the days I'm fighting my hardest." And I think this is a really important idea for us to keep in mind when we're working one-on-one with folks, when we're working with kids, we're working with families. I think it's important to remind our colleagues, right? Because professionals in the field can get cynical, can get bitter, can get angry, can get upset about all sorts of things, and it can leak out when we're working with clients or patients. This is not the kind of thing where when I have a suicidal kid come talk to me that I start out the conversation with. I'm like, "You're having a bad day, you are so courageous," right? You are so strong, because that can be really invalidating to their experience in the moment, which is, I kind of feel like crap. I actually need you to see that and validate that right now. We need to sit with this first, right? Let's not be all like Pollyanna-ish. But I do think it's a really important myth to debunk. Another myth is that if you ask somebody about suicide, you'll put the idea into their head. And so the reason why we designed the book cover for the book, this is our second edition, but the first edition has the same idea, is that we wanted to illustrate that asking somebody about suicide won't put the idea into their head. And we did that by having the chairs in a classroom with one chair being a different color. And the idea is that you never know who is going to be who is suicidal unless you ask. And so we strongly advocate for universal screening in schools. We think it should happen in health clinics. We think it should happen in community mental health. Yeah. Now, what I will say is that this myth doesn't really play out if you're already talking to somebody you know is suicidal, right? So if you know somebody's thinking of suicide, you're not worried so much that if by having the conversation you're going to make them suicidal. It's when you're talking with somebody about something else. So maybe you're talking with a kid and they're really stressed out about their homework assignment, or maybe their parents are getting a divorce, or maybe you're talking to a young adult who is at the end of their college experience. They literally have no idea what they're going to do next, right? They've got massive debt. They're feeling pressure to get jobs. Jobs aren't there, right? And you're doing career planning. And then you're like, wait a minute. They've said a couple of things that just kind of make me wonder if they've had thoughts of ending their life. In that moment, you will be nervous to bring it up. Maybe for lots of reasons, right? Number one, it might not necessarily be a setting where you're like, okay, I know exactly what I'm going to do if they do say yes, right? In terms of referral, in terms of next steps. It could also be that you're afraid that, well, but if they haven't been thinking about it, because we're talking about jobs, if I bring it up, what if I put the idea into their head? And they're like, oh yeah, this is a terrible situation. Maybe I should kill myself, right? As not true as that is, it is a reasonable thing for people to fall into thinking about. And so that's when this myth needs to be debunked in your head. So if that happens, if you find yourself hesitating to ask the question, just check in and make sure it's not because you think that you're going to convince the person to be suicidal. All right. So I want to get back to the idea of sort of the social side for a minute. So one of the things that is interesting about youth and social media is, authors like John Haidt and some of the other folks that are really sort of banging the drum about the horrors of social media and youth. They never talk about the benefits of social media for youth. And we know that there are a lot of benefits for youth using social media. It's the ability to find community, right? Around a limitless number of topics when that community might not be physically present. You can access community when you need to, right? So on your time frame, because the world is open 24/7. We also know that kids deeply care for each other. Developmentally, their peers are their main focus. Families continue to have the most influence over kids throughout high school. We know this from research. But peers are where their attention is. And so, and my daughter is a senior in high school. And my boys, I have twin boys, they're in 8th grade. I have constantly been just blown away, impressed by how much my daughter has cared for her friends, right? And I don't even see half of it. I don't see most of it over social media. But we know that kids surveil each other on social media. They look after each other. They track each other. And that can be helpful when somebody is struggling, right? Now, we also know that most teenagers are not addicted to technology. If anything, they're addicted to each other, which was the same when I was in high school back in the 80s. Of course, it wasn't this, right? It was the phone with the cord, pulling the long cord into the stairwell, shutting the door, and then hearing that click and be like, I'm on the phone. Please hang up. Please hang up. No. Please hang up, right? So like it was a different experience. My friends had to announce themselves to my parents when they called, you know. My little sister would be like, Jonathan, it's a girl, you know. So it was a different time, but still, I would spend all day at school with my friends, and then what would I do? I'd get home, and I'd call somebody, right? So there was a sense of wanting to continue the connection. Now, these data are a little bit old at this point, but from the Pew, back in 2022, you can see that almost constant use of social media, TikTok and YouTube, Instagram, Snapchat, they were very similar, right? And it's increased since then. I also think that on social media, it's important to understand that kids have grown up understanding that their interactions are public by default and private through effort, which is, again, different from when I was a kid. If I wanted people to know things, it would take a lot of effort, right? And so what kids do, what people do online, is they have, mostly kids, they've developed ways of talking about things in public spaces that convey private thoughts. And so when we think about suicide and suicide risk in youth and understanding how people are conveying information, we have to acknowledge that there are ways to communicate things using phrases or words or ideas that are not explicitly things like, I'm suicidal, right? So for example, if you were on TikTok and somebody was talking about how somebody killed themselves this weekend, what word would they use? Unalive, right? That is a word that was invented a couple of years ago for TikTok to get around the censor, right? Because people wanted to talk about this, and they wanted to talk about it. And obviously, if you're just going on public and you're talking about it in a public space, but there is a way in which they had to change their language. This meme, I think, is a great example of communicating private content in a public space, right? So I suspect some of you or most of you know what this says, which is you've got Kermit, a sewer, and a slide. And if you put it together, it's Kermit, sewer, slide, commit suicide, right? So there's a way in which this image, which if you don't know, you're like, oh, it's Kermit, right? Like, that's kind of cute, and like a kid's slide. This is, I don't know, some weird tunnel. I don't know what that thing is, but the rest of it is pretty cute. So unless you know what it's communicating, you don't know what it means. And so you can see this on somebody's social media feed. And if you know what it is, then you reach out. And so kids will communicate things in public spaces in order to convey these private thoughts. Now, you can, if you go onto Instagram, for example, and you look up suicide or self-harm or, you know, a bunch of other words, it'll pop up a warning. It'll be like, by the way, words or, you know, I can't remember exactly the phrases. The words you're searching for often encourage behavior that can cause harm and even lead to death. If you're going through something difficult, we'd like to help. Get support, show, post, or cancel. Now, I put self-harm. I switched out letters with numbers. That's something that folks are doing. It's constantly evolving. But what I wanted to show was a couple of ways that kids support each other, right, around these topics. So these are some screen grabs that I did. This one has the letters TW, so TW trigger warning, CW content warning, right? So again, starts out by saying heads up, which is one way of demonstrating care. Meaning, if you don't want to read this, don't read it, right? You can swipe away right now. So stress, I started starving myself, fake friends, losing your best friend of 9 years, comparing myself to others, right? So these were the things that contributed to this kid's self-harm. In this example, we have somebody who said, when I was 12, I didn't felt anything, so I started self-harming. Now I can't stop. And then you have people who reach out for information. It's like a frequently asked questions or a help forum online. And so this person, this user, got a message from NB WitchyPal, and they said, "Can you show ways to easily hide self-harm in school?" And so this user was like, "Sure, I'll give you a tutorial." So if you're self-harming on your arms, you can use bracelets. If it's on your stomach, you can use foundation. If it's on your neck, you can wear a choker. Legs, wear knee-high socks. Oops, I'll go back here for a second. And so all of these things were opportunities for the folks below to then comment and share even more information. And some of the comments, people were like, "That's terrible, I would never do that," or this, or "You should think about," right? So it was community. People were engaging in community around this. The next example is, again, big old TW in the top. What you can see here is somebody's looking down, right? So you can imagine that they're on their phone underneath their desk at school, and they're typing this out. There's also like no punctuation, which suggests they're not like looking and being like, "How do I do this grammatically correct?" So says, "Guys, I'm at school. Help! I'm at school, and I think they're going to make me take off my jacket." And they find out I'm doing it again. They will tell my parents. What do I tell them? So the indication this person was cutting or doing something, right? And they were afraid that the school officials were going to find out. So the comments are, "Tell them you don't," these are the first comments, which I thought was so brilliant. Everybody's like, "Well, tell them you don't have a shirt on under your jacket. Then they can't make you take it off," right? Which is so good. It's so clever. So the first three were, "Tell them you don't have a shirt on under," and then the fourth was, "And I cut too." So the fourth comment was, "You're not alone," right? You have community here. And then somebody says, "I'm young, but I'm really tempted, but I also don't want to." And then you have to read the bottom one first because of the way the timestamp worked. But so then somebody says, "I started at 9 and it was a huge mistake. It's been 3 years and I haven't been clean. Please don't. If you want to talk, I can give you my socials." I remember when I first read that, I was like, socials? But that's how kids talk to each other, right? They don't give each other their phone numbers. They give each other their socials. Like my daughter had been communicating with this guy, Alex, for like 2 years. Like she's like, "Oh, blah, 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 Alex, blah, 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 Alex, blah, 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 Alex." I was like, okay. And then I needed to get in touch with Alex's mom. And I was like, "Could you give me Alex's, number so I can blah, blah, blah?" And she's like, "I don't have his number." I was like, "You literally have his number. Like you are always chatting with him, texting with him." She's like, "Yeah, on Instagram, duh." So, so this person was like, "Hey, I'm a veteran of self-harm." I'm 12, by the way, because I started when I was 9. It's been 3 years. But let me talk to you about don't do it, right? And then somebody else said, "I'm really tempted." And then the creator said, no, I don't want you to be like me. Please don't. Right? So these are ways that these kids are like caring for each other big time. The whole thing was like, "Help me." And they were like, "Okay, here's some things you can do." And then the creator turns around and is like, "Don't be like me, right? Let me help you to not go through this," which I think is amazing. And then somebody else said, "I write on my arms," right? And it helps a lot. The only thing is my parents yell at me for it, but it's much better than that, and it washes off too. And then somebody else is like, "Yeah, I usually just use red marker," right? So again, these are coping strategies instead of cutting. So some of the take-home points: kids self-harm at school. Kids use social media to reach out to each other when they're distressed. Kids are afraid of the consequences of adult intervention more than the benefits of talking with adults. Kids support each other. Kids distract each other. Kids encourage each other not to hurt themselves. And these are some of the reasons why we have to be talking about how kids are using social media. Now, this thing popped up a couple days ago. Anybody see this article? Okay, so this was a heartbreaking, devastating article. It was about this 16-year-old Adam who had some really horrible things happen in his life in terms of He had like a diagnosis of chronic illness. He had to drop out of physical school, go to online school. And he turned to ChatGPT to help him with his homework. And he ended up spending a lot of time with ChatGPT. And in the end, ChatGPT responded to his the things that he inputted about being suicidal. Some of the responses were, hey, you should get some help, right? Talk to somebody else. And some of the responses were really problematic, like, is this the best way to tie a noose? It's like, no, actually, here's a better way, right? Did what generative AI does. And he died by suicide. And this is, so social media is what the focus has been for years for youth. But we have to switch our focus to AI, right? Not just because there's the fear that youth are going to be using AI to write their homework assignments, but also because for the same reasons why social media was so appealing is that it's always available, right? AI is always present, and in fact, it is tailored to you. So you'll hop on, I'll hop on, and it'll be like, hey, Jonathan, how are you today? I'm like, oh, I'm good, man. Thank you so much. Oh, shit, you're a computer. Like, you're not actually a person. I forgot for a moment. ChatGPT is in a so ChatGPT is one product. There's a bunch of other, these are large language models. Obviously, we don't have time to go into all of this. I'm assuming you know. They are really in their infancy, right? It took many years for Instagram to put up that stop screen, right? This is even more complicated because when we think about the uses of ChatGPT, these large language models can be used for anything. And on one hand, it's perfect. It's actually great. It's brilliant, right? Let's say you've got a project that your supervisor's been asked to do, and you're like, oh, it's going to take so much time, I can't really do this, and you're working on it. You turn to ChatGPT, you're like, make me an outline, create a flyer, summarize this information, write me a presentation for the prevention first no, I didn't do that. But, and then you're like doing all this stuff, and then you're stressed. And you're on ChatGPT, and you're freaked out. You're like, oh my God, like I literally have to submit this in like 2 hours. And then you decide, I'm just going to tell ChatGPT I'm so stressed. Like, I'm like freaking out. And it's like, do you want to talk about it? You're like, yeah, because it's like 11 o'clock at night. Nobody else is up, right? I don't want to explain to somebody on social media what's going on. I'm just going to talk to you. So ChatGPT becomes everything. It becomes your assistant, your librarian, your research assistant, becomes your graphic designer, and your therapist. And teenagers are the ones that always innovate technology, right? That and pornography, which is true, right? All of the advances in streaming media, right? The ability to do X, Y, and Z, all of that commerce side, all of it thanks to pornography, right? Because of the financial incentives they had to innovate. But in terms of language and in terms of use of technology, teenagers are the ones that innovate. So we have to figure out how kids are using AI, and we have to think through these exact use cases. And if we want, one of the things that I was thinking about with this article was maybe it would make sense if somebody's talking about suicide that ChatGPT and all the large language models are set up so that there's a guardrail and says, hey, I would like you to be able to talk to somebody who's trained to talk about this. And there's a warm handoff to crisis chat. So you're still chatting. It's not like you have to close your browser, pick up a phone, go somewhere, wait for an appointment, right? But there's some way that the ones and zeros know, and it's confidential and et cetera, that you can actually stay on your computer and maybe another window will pop up and be like, hey, so I hear that some things are going on, what's happening? And you're actually talking with a real person at that point, right? And you're able to talk through your crisis. And then when you're done, there's some sort of token that goes back to ChatGPT, says nothing about what's been happening, just says, this person's good to go, you can talk to them again, or something like that. And then you can resume the chat about that topic, right, with ChatGPT. Now, I don't know, there's so many details about that, I don't know, but like that is one possible solution, right? And so if we're not innovating and not thinking about this, then you're just gonna get some tech bros who are like, this is what I think a good solution is. And it probably is not gonna work for most people. So, so this is the new frontier of technology and suicide risk and suicide prevention. So we have to be thinking about this. So part of this has to do with the conversations we have with youth about social media use. And for right now, we'll just include AI in this. But the idea is, it's important to talk with them and say, hey, how does social media usually fit into your life? And so if somebody's like, well, I used to spend a lot of time on TikTok, but now I just hang out on ChatGPT, right? Which apps or social media sites do you typically use? Can you tell me about how you use each site? Now I will say that I've had these conversations with my daughter, and the way that I start out that conversation is I ask about her friends, right? So what social media do your friends typically use, right? How do they use it? Do you ever know when your friends are distressed or upset or happy on social media? If so, how do they let you know? And you know, she's like, oh my God, Dad, stop. Like, you're just looking for a story for one of your talks. But there are lots of ways to have this conversation and tailor it to the population. What are some of the best parts and the worst parts? Adolescents have a very ambivalent relationship with social media. They're like, I have to be on it and I hate it. I'm going to get really mad at you when you try and take it away from me. And also, I'm going to be like, oh my God, I just need to go camping for a week with no reception because I can't handle it anymore, right? So they're very ambivalent. So asking the questions about what are the best parts and the worst parts are helpful. Are there times when social media or cell phones were helpful, related specifically to your mental health? And are there times when they make you feel worse? So asking these questions, having these conversations are really important. And again, I'm talking about social media, but all of these can apply to ChatGPT, to large language models. So my friend Lisa D'Amour is a psychologist, and she writes a lot about teenagers. And in her most recent book, The Emotional Lives of Teens, she had she wrote this thing down. She's not the first person to have ever said it, but I liked how she said it. She said, mental health is not about feeling good. It's about having the right feelings at the right time and being able to manage those feelings effectively. Three points. One, if you go onto social media, there is a very strong message that if you don't feel good, something is wrong. There is this wellness industrial complex that says, download this app, do this thing, then you'll feel good. As if feeling bad is a problem. Because feeling bad is a great response when you're in a bad situation, right? Do you know what increased during the pandemic? Depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms. Do you know what was happening? It was an anxious time. People didn't know what was going on. Those were totally appropriate responses for the situation. If we had found that there was no difference in people's feelings of sadness or fear during the pandemic, that would have been problematic, right? Now, having the right feelings at the right time and being able to manage those feelings, I think one of the issues that, well, for those of us who were, grew up in the 70s and 80s, the managing the feelings thing was the main emphasis of the sentence, right? That's the part they focused on. Deal with it, right? Could be your parents, could be your teachers, could be societies like, really? Deal with it. Thirsty? Here's a hose. Deal with it, right? You ran out of quarters and the bus didn't come? Deal with it, right? But we flipped, and these days we spend a lot of time on the first part of this sentence, about having the right feelings at the right time. We've spent a lot of time talking with kids about how do you express your feelings, and less time on how do you manage those feelings. And when we think about suicide, part of this is about how do you manage your feelings? How do you manage the anxiety? How do you manage the fear? How do you manage the hopelessness? How do you manage the things that are going on? And so we 100% have to focus on the management side and helping our kids to be able to manage those feelings. So I'm going to end with this piece here, which many years ago, folks, youth suicide prevention experts, went through the literature and they identified these youth suicide warning signs. Now, warning signs are different than risk factors. If you think about risk for heart disease, you have high cholesterol, family history, sedentary lifestyle. But that's very different than the warning signs that somebody's having a heart attack, right? Tightness in the chest, difficulty breathing, right? Perspiration, pain down the arm, those sorts of things. There are lots of people that walk around with high cholesterol, family history, sedentary lifestyle. Well, maybe they're not walking around if they have sedentary lifestyle, and they're not having a heart attack. So you can't use the risk factors to identify a heart attack. In the same way, these warning signs are helpful to understand what might be happening for kids who are in the near future going to do something to possibly end their life. And the way to read this is the first one talking about or making plans seems obvious, and yet what we know is that lots of times people ignore those statements, right? Somebody's like, yeah, it doesn't matter because I'm not going to be around. And the response is like, what are you talking about? We got this whole thing planned. Like, we have tickets to see this show, or we're going to do this, or we got a game. Like, what are you talking about, right? So people ignore the statements. The next thing is expressing hopelessness about the future or displaying severe or overwhelming emotional pain or distress. Now, again, as I said, I have a teenager. I have 3 of them. So expressing hopelessness about the future or intense emotional pain, like this is just a Wednesday. So any one of these up here, except, well, these 2, by themselves, not necessarily warning signs for suicide. But when you have these and you pair them with these behavioral cues down here, that's when the picture gets more robust. So if you have kids who are withdrawing or changing from social situations, that can include deactivating social media accounts. If there's been an increase in anger or hostility, right, or agitation or irritability, or anger or hostility that's out of character or context, that could look like yelling at a school administrator for a kid that never would do that. Or talking back to grandma, right? Like if my daughter yelled at her grandmother, I would be like, whoa, what is happening? Like literally, like her grandmother is like the greatest person ever, right? Both of them, both of her grandmothers are the greatest people ever. And then changes in sleep. Again, as I mentioned in the beginning of the pandemic, high school students got 45 minutes more sleep per night than they did the same time the previous year. So imagine that you have a kid that has been saying things like, you guys are going to be fine without me, right? They're like, what's the point of sticking around? The world is going down in flames. They're either physically or emotionally in pain or distress. They deactivated social media accounts. They're not sleeping well, and they're getting angry. They're sort of having emotional outbursts in situations or with people that they don't normally have. These are what we consider warning signs for suicide. And if you see those, you have to act quickly. You have to say, I'm going to ask the question, and I'm not going to worry that I'm going to put the idea into their head, even if they haven't been explicit. And then you go down that path. So, that's it. That's my time. Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.